Tonight's speaker, Steve Schrade from Duanesburg. He's lived here his whole life, and he goes back to seven generations on the Schrade side. So we can call him a native of Duanesburg. Steve, tonight, all yours.
Thanks, Lenny. Wait and see what happens.
After that introduction, we're lucky you're just here.
All right. Before I begin the presentation, I want to thank Howard Oldhouse, who helped with some research, and Bart McDougall for verifying some of the facts that I'm about to present regarding history in Duanesburg about 60 years ago. And the Historical Society records and photos are mainly what's are being shown up here. There's a really good treasure of information up there, and I thank Sherry, my wife, for researching and trying to find the stuff that I was looking for. So what I'm able to add to this story, and it'll become evident, self-evident as we go on, is my personal impression and memories from the point of view of an 11 and 12-year-old kid. This was 1960, went into 61. I was 11, going on 12, and there was not much going on in those days. There wasn't a lot scheduled after school. I wasn't involved with sports yet. And I'd come home, and as soon as I changed, I'd head over to what is now the landing, or a portion of what is now the landing, and watch the work go on. So the basic facts filled in with my recollections. We'll start first with the Duanesburg Crossroads, early 20th century. You
want me to go back?
No. I think I'll use this little thing. That's the place, that's the White House in the title. That's the Mott and Sherwin's General Store when it was McDougall's General Store, and before that. And that is now what is, it was most recently Route 20 liquor and wine and liquor. So I just want to review a few of these old, see if you can tell, to be able to see how old some of these buildings are. Go ahead, Sharon. That is O'Neill's store. That's where the town park is now, or the little grassy strip on the west end of town.
That's the gray house. They moved it, that uninhabited gray house.
I didn't know that. So.
Yeah, that they moved that. They took that facade off,
yeah,
and they moved that back. That had been right, as you just said,
yeah,
where the park is now.
Yeah.
The main building is still there, but unused.
There's another view. This time it includes the blacksmith shop, which I suspect is located now on the grassy lawn where in front of Stewart's.
Yes.
And the house again is there, and then there's again the store, which is still standing. And lastly, just across the street, out of interest, there's the hub on the left with its carriage shed attached with a hall, a meeting hall, probably a dance hall upstairs. And does anybody know what happened to that shed?
It became houses, didn't it?
No. Well, it sort of.
Yeah.
Raymond Schrade, my grandfather, bought that little plot of land, tore the shed down, took the lumber over to his brother's farm, which was Coolidge's, or we might know him as a across the railroad tracks and back in behind Murphy's old ice cream shop. They built a barn in it.
What year is that picture?
That is, I think, in the 20s.
Yeah,
Yeah, looking
from
at
the
the
cars, yeah,
Yeah,
from the cars.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so there's some background. And it was called the Case Tavern, now the Hub. Go ahead, Sharon. And we'll look at some updated pictures about the time. Still, you know, it wasn't easy to find photos of all of the old buildings, or even from 60 years ago.
And some of the photos
Nobody
are
had
great.
iPhones to click the pictures. Anyway, this says, if you can't read it, Dee's Restaurant, Tourist Rooms, Duanesburg, New York, Peter Liebes, proprietor. Now that, I didn't even know that he was the proprietor of Dee's Restaurant, but that, of course, again, is where Marty Pavlik and Peg had their Duanesburg restaurant. All right, next. Mobile gas. This was likely a 50s picture with the Duanesburg or Delanson marching band on Memorial Day. Next. Back on the western end of town, Harry Alexander Shell gas station. I heard a lot of stories about that. And if you see up at the top there, you see the partial word liquor. That was Florence Pop's liquor, wine and liquor store. And a person here tonight at one time owned the business in that same location. Do you care to reveal yourself? Or it has some good stories. You could probably make a presentation and take up a whole hour of information from that. Okay, next. I thought this was interesting. I think this was pre-World War II. It was Kennedy's Restaurant, and it went from that to the Village Inn, to the Beacon, to
Post office.
yes, post office, and then most recently it's something in between that.
There was another meat market in there.
Yeah, Sirens. Anyway, that's Sirens, and they're selling Gulf gasoline in front. They had a restaurant, and and this was from one of the books the Historical Societies put out. They had cabins in the back, as Bart mentioned last month, and I think it was run by Leroy Kennedy and his wife. And number 12, Dave, does that look familiar?
Sure does.
Because it's the picture you put in for the new report. Anyway, before it was, and Dave probably knows farther back, but before it was a gas station, it was Florence Pop's liquor store. So she, I think, when Dave's grandfather, Leroy Knowles, wanted to make it a gas station, he asked Florence to kindly move. And I don't know the whole story behind it, but it was right across from where I lived, my childhood. It's right on Route 20. It's where Pat Waltz has his manufacturing, brand new building, a nicely landscaped manufacturing plant now.
That became my grandfather's, when he was town justice, that's where he held court.
Yeah. So it had many uses. Okay.
Wasn't it also like a Moval or something?
Mobile Realty?
It was up on Route 7.
No, but I think...
Was it down there too?
Moval was on 20 across from my house.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Okay, that's the same building.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's it now. I remember now.
I think it was for a while.
And then Dick O'Connor had a snack bar in there.
Yeah.
A whole bunch of stuff going on.
Yeah. Okay, sure. This is fun, isn't it? All right. Then there's, again, from one of the another part of the west end of town, 3 versions of the Duane Diner. The one up on top is most interesting to me. I remember the other 2. And of course, next is Gid's store and gas station. Everybody knows about that. And there are 3 or 4 other ones that I want to mention. Down behind the store was, and Bart, I thank Bart for reminding me of this, Tanner and Gifford. Is that the name?
That's behind Mott and Sherwin.
Behind, it was in the same building.
Same building.
But down and behind,
Yeah.
feed and
You
grain.
go right straight through to the back of Mott and Sherwin's general store to where the work clothes and the rubbers and galoshes were. In the middle of that wall was a door that you would open and take about 4 steps to go down into Tanner and Gifford's, and you open the door, you could smell that feed.
Yeah,
And it was cold outside in sheds.
yeah. So little by little, the stores, that store or that business shut down, and little by little the sheds were torn down. But I remember as a kid still being there. The hub was, we all know where that is. That was run by Harry Reardon. He always parked his car out front. I think we always thought, or my father said, Harry thinks that if he looks like he has a customer, then I'll bring in more customers. So, I don't know if that's true. My mother worked there as a waitress at one time. Raymond Kennedy had a garage and gas station. They sold Atlantic. He sold Atlantic, and most recently it's vacant now, was most recently Mike Hebert's electric and power generator facility. Then down the hill was Murphy's Ice Cream. Love to go down there, and of course later on they were up on Route 7. They shut down but came back and opened up Murphy's on top of 7. And then a little farther along was the cinder block manufacturer, again, Leroy Kennedy, Roy Kennedy. I misspoke them for, okay. All right, the next partners who had a plan. There's Chuck Mott and Mike Schrade, probably just out of pretty close to just being discharged from U.S. Army. That's the only picture I have of Chuck. Of course, I got a lot of my dad, but he's smoking a cigar. My dad has a glass of, I'm sure it's lemonade. They were young. They were friends, and they formed a partnership. And I'll tell you a little bit about each one of them. First, we'll go with Sherwin M. Mike Schrade. Born January 1, 1916, in the four-square house, four-square meaning like symmetrical, just 4 squares. It was a reaction against the Victorian era Queen Anne stuff with all the decorations on it. On Route 20, just west of the intersection, at the bottom of the hill, you cross the Norman Skill, and it still sits there, and it's where Harry Alexander lived. That's a little side note. He was born there. He was raised, however, in the family home on Route 7, just east of what is now Stewart's. It's now occupied by the owner and operator of the Duanesburg Diner. He attended the District Number 5 school, which stood directly across the street from his home, and where there was a teacher who was a relative of a couple of the people here. Her name was Catherine Suits, Bob's grandmother and my great aunt. And she was the teacher, and so Sherwin behaved himself pretty well. my father did tell me a story that he can remember Chuck maybe not behaving, and Catherine, who was pretty good size and strong, kind of wrestled him down on the floor and disciplined him. And I don't know, that might have just been a story, but it sounded about right. My dad attended Draper High School. In those days, there was a bus that every day took a number of teenagers into Rotterdam to attend Draper. He graduated from there. He attended Union College, graduated in 1938, worked in a cannery in Leroy, New York, and also worked for his father in between times, both at the Congo roller skating rink, which I've talked about other times, in dance hall, as well as the roller rink and dance hall that his father operated in Mariahville. He was drafted into the Army in March of 1941, honorably discharged in December 1945 after serving in the Pacific Theater during the war. Returning to Duanesburg, he found two new partners. First, most importantly, his wife, my mother, Jean Juno, was her last name, and second, his business partner, Chuck Mott, who was discharged a little bit before him. Chuck was born in 1913. He attended also the District 5 school, as I mentioned, and was also taught by Mrs. Suits. Chuck served in the U.S. Navy during World War II as a seaman second class on a LST, which is a landing craft, I think, right, Bob? And was honorably discharged in May 1945. Chuck had married the former Alice Wilbur, January 8, 1939. Two men were good friends and had known each other all their lives. And as teenagers, I think, it was about then, they both decided, and you've heard this before, they wanted to be known as Mike and Chuck because they didn't like Sherwin and Raymond. So they proclaimed themselves with new names. All right, number 19. This is the store, Mott and Sherwin store. The photo was taken by Catherine Suits. And this shows a whole different front for that store with an addition, kind of just one brick in, length of one brick in on the left-hand side. So an apartment was made overhead. Their business partnership was established in 1946. They bought the long-established general store in the hamlet from Ralph McDougall, but it was run at that time by Alva Schaefer. The plan was to expand and modernize the business. A more contemporary brick front replaced the traditional wooden front of the building, and an addition, which I pointed out, was made to the east end of the building. Furthermore, the roof was raised and modified as a flat, sloping roof to accommodate the apartment on the second floor. The first floor addition had the new location for the post office. I think it had been, according to Bart's presentation previously, had been over at the Duanesburg restaurant just before it moved there.
Yep.
Prior to that, I think.
And the postmaster was Pete Levis.
Pete Levis, yeah.
So it makes sense.
Remember, Pete had a little card rack in that post office where he would sell greeting cards and such. One time the postal inspector came along, my dad told me this, and said, "Mr. Levis, you can't have your private business in the post office." So we made him take the card rack out. As a kid, I thought, that's kind of mean. But behind the post office was the new meat market, which was a big deal. From 1946 to 1964, Mike managed the day-to-day operations of the general store, walking to and from work from his small home on Route 20, just a few hundred feet away. The store was open 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day, except Friday, which was an old, and this was kind of an old tradition. The farmers would come in on a Friday after they'd worked the fields for the week, and they'd come in, buy the goods they needed, and they would run a tab in the general store. That wasn't so much the case there, but that's from whence it came, I believe. By the time Dad and Chuck were running it, or my father was running it, it wasn't all farmers that came in after working the whole week, but it was open till 9. The store was closed on Sundays and all major holidays. Mike was a founding member of the Duanesburg Volunteer Fire Company, served 30 years, 30-year member of the Vestry of Christ Church, a parent and volunteer for Boy Scout Troop 55 because when I wanted to be a Boy Scout, Troop 51 had collapsed temporarily, so we joined Troop 55, led by Scoutmaster Joseph Tinning. And also, he was a member of the Duanes Republican Club. A little bit about Chuck and his family. Now, they lived on a farm. I think most people know where that farm is west of the hamlet and along the Norman Skill Creek. It's where Scott's printing was, and Scott Raleigh owns it now. The farm, by the way, which had at one time been in the Schrade family during the latter part of the 1800s. He raised beef cattle, Black Angus, grew hay and corn, did contracting work, and sold gravel, which he mined from his property. Chuck accessed his gravel pit using the abandoned D&H railroad bed, which ran up to and through his property, eventually headed west toward Delancey. He sold, for a time, he sold cinders. You know what cinders are? Probably. I bet not too many people, younger people today, know what cinders are. But for driveways, which was kind of a specialty, because not many contractors had access to cinders. Of course, the cinders were the ash and clinkers, according to what I read in the definition, from the coal-burning locomotives. And they would just dump, when they were cleaning out the ash bins and the engine, they just dump them along the side. So you could only sell cinders if you owned a former railroad bed, and that was pretty rare. Chuck was town supervisor from 1959 to 1964. He was also a member of Christ Church, the Duanesburg Volunteer Fire Company, and the Republican Club. Okay. Now, there's the house that you got two men, and there's the White House. And we'll go to the next picture. You see the proximity. Now, this obviously isn't mid-20th century, but it was the best picture I could find in a limited search, admittedly, of the Turnbull House. And it was probably early 20th century right there. But it gives a full view of the house. For 14 years, Mott and Sherwin's General Store had served the community well, but both men realized that in order for the business to thrive, changes were needed. Post office needed a larger space. Parking at the store was limited, especially as Route 20 grew wider and increasingly encroached on the tiny parking space just in front of the store building. The automobiles were bigger, and delivery trucks had difficulty maneuvering to unload goods. More and more customers also were attracted to the new supermarkets sprouting up in Rotterdam and Schenectady. I remember my grandfather on my mother's side warned my father. He said, "Sherwin, get out of the store business because the supermarkets are going to take over." And this was in the early 50s, so he saw that coming. When the former Turnbull house next door went up for sale in 1959, Chuck and Mike decided that it made sense to purchase the property and expand the business. The owners at the time were listed as Elsie Borsdorf and Charlotte Sigler, who I believe was her daughter. And Elsie, I remember her, she was around some of the time and not usually in the winter, I don't think. So usually the home was vacant. The sale was finalized on October 1st, 1959. This house sat close to Route 20, as you can see. With a walkout basement, the property surrounding the house was at least 8 to 10 feet below the elevation of the highway, and a major component of the project was to draw fill to the site to make the lot accessible for customer parking, as well as to facilitate the removal of the house from fronting on Route 20 and moving it back on the lot. In late 1959 and through the spring of 1960, Chuck Mott trucked load after load of gravel to the site from his gravel pit. Meanwhile, the foundation of the house was under construction in the back southeast corner in preparation for moving day. Cinder blocks were used to build the foundation wall, and that turned out to be an unfortunate miscalculation. Remember in those years, there wasn't a building inspector that I believe, and I don't think anybody had to really have a permit to build or put up any structure. Am I wrong on that, or was there? There was. I don't think there was any. It was kind of the Wild West. If you wanted to, you could do whatever you wanted with it. So we'll get back to why the cinder blocks were an error. You probably can guess. After much gravel was hauled to the site and the foundation constructed, the house was moved with the wooden portion of the basement level, you see kind of back there, had been demolished, and it was readied for placement on the new foundation. And number 3, there's the carpenter. He's the third guy, the third man involved with this, Spencer Christman. Most of the renovation and remodeling of the building was carried out by Spence. He was born in 1899 and raised on the Christman farm, which is now, of course, the Christman Sanctuary. His father was the well-known author, W.W. Christman, and Spence had 5 brothers and 1 sister. In 1917, at the age of 18, Spencer enlisted in the National Guard, served overseas in France during World War I with the 105th Infantry from May 1918 to March 1919. And he received the Conspicuous Service Cross for his time overseas. Spence married, had a family, and worked as a carpenter on many homes and buildings throughout the town. He did have some challenges in his life, which led to a situation in 1960 where he was then living by himself in an upstairs room at Marty and Peg Pavlik's Duanesburg restaurant. If you want to know a little bit more about Spence, Betty Funk wrote a nice story about him in Volume 1 of Remembering Duanesburg. And I met Spence, as I said, because I just wandered over there one day. He didn't seem to be too grumpy to me, and he would show me. He'd be hammering away, and he was a skinny guy, but he was strong, and he'd be hammering away at something like that, and he'd grab his arm and he'd go, whoo, whoo. And then on Fridays, I wasn't sure if I would say this, but it was a different time. On Fridays, my dad would bring over some refreshments because Spence kind of needed something to keep him going, and he liked beer. And so Dad would bring over a quantity, and it had to be warm because that's how Spence liked it. So he keep going. Chuck and Mike decided to hire Spence as a carpenter despite his potential shortcomings. Both men had known him for years. They knew he was a very good carpenter, and decided to give him a chance. There were some distant familial relations between both men and Spence. Chuck, this first is a little convoluted, distant, but anyway. Chuck's wife Alice had a sister, Gladys, who married Spence's brother. So indirectly, there was a connection there. It was Phil Christman, and Gladys Wilbur married Phil Christman. Phil and Gladys lived over on Duane Lake. Phil was a barber, cut my hair in my younger years. My dad and I would go over to his house. He was a mail carrier. His son was Corky Christman, who we all know about, and that was the Christman family. They were all very talented in one way or the other. And this I didn't know. Mike was a second cousin of Spence through the Weaver family. Jacob Weaver had the farm for which Weaver Road was named. All right, so Chuck and Mike were anxious for the building to be renovated and rented. They were looking for a return on their investment, as they had taken out a big loan to fund the project. The plan was to move the post office from the cramped quarters in the general store building to the newly refurbished commercial building, which my father christened as the Federal Building, because the post office was going to go there. The project started well, as Spence turned out what had been the living room in the front left side, which was only one room deep, by the way. It was the living room at the front of the former home into a space which was larger than the current post office in the store, and it would handle the post office, or so they thought. Negotiations on renting the space went along slowly until, much to the chagrin of the partners, the post office officials said the proposed state, already finished, ready for move-in, was too small. And so Chuck and Mike kind of said, well, what are we going to do? We want the rent, I think it was $100 a month or some pretty good sum in those days. So plans were made for an addition directly behind that one room on the front left corner. The first step that was taken was a solid concrete foundation along the east side of the, now it was the house, instead of using cinder blocks. Next, floor joists were salvaged from the Duanesburg Community Fire Hall, because how many remember there being a stage, a wooden stage, and shows being held in the fire hall? Like,
There was a basketball court.
a basketball court, but the stage was kind of down one end, and so the court was still, the basketball court still had the key-shaped zone, not what it is today. I know because my dad had a key to the place when he was a fireman, and we used to ride our bikes down there and go in and shoot baskets. We could do it in the winter too. There was no heat up there. I'm kind of getting off track here, and the basketballs didn't bounce as well, but we still were there with our cold hands, and happy to have a place to do that. Anyway, the stage was a big monstrosity, and what had happened was the fire company's insurance company came around and ironically said, you know, this is a fire hazard that you've got. So it had to go. So the stage had to go. Well, the floor joists for the stage were rough cut, 2 by 10 or even 2 by 12. I remember seeing them. elm.
Oh, wow.
They were, what, probably 20, 15, I don't know. I don't know how deep the stage went, but it was enough so that they could then take those floor joists for the stage. They trucked them back to the site of where the addition to the post office had to be, and they could lay them perpendicular to the new wall and connect them that way. The partners, Chuck and Mike, were desperate to economize because, well, they just were. They weren't getting any rent, and the costs were mounting up. So I remember Spence being pretty, he didn't like that because he had to work with used materials, and that insulted his art or something. I don't know. It was probably harder to work with. All the siding they tore off, they put back on to reuse it. So the floor of the addition was completed, and the lumber and other materials came from Delanson, from, who do you think? A.J. Horrow, right? They were still in business then. So Horrow's materials were still being delivered by train, I think, maybe. Any siding or other, I said that. Eventually the post office officials approved the space, and the post office moved into yet another location. It had kind of been hopping around the village in almost like a semicircle. Ended up there at that time. Walt Willoughby had succeeded Pete Levis, and he was the new postmaster. The next spaces to be renovated were the front apartment on the second floor and the new barbershop on the first floor, which was next to the new post office. Tenants were already lined up. Spence worked steadily to get things ready. The tenant for the apartment was chosen, and it was a lady named Rhoda Foster. And by coincidence, I guess, another cousin, distant cousin of my father. So, I don't know if, well, she had been living with her sister on Fiddler Road, and Albert knew them. And Rhoda ended up on the second. She was a larger woman and get up in age. She had outlived 3 husbands already. So she was tough. And she moved kind of slowly, and in my opinion, as a 12-year-old, she was kind of fierce looking and acting. Anyway, she took the front apartment, the new upstairs. The new space for the barbershop was rented to John Burke. We probably remember him. Yeah, real nice guy. And
he never made change. When you got your hair cut,
yeah,
you went up to the cash register, you
made your own change.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, the haircuts, I think adult cuts were 75 cents maybe to start with, when he first started over in the 75, and maybe the kids were a quarter, something like that. I think he got all the way up over there to like $1.25 or $1.50 for a adult, and probably 75 cents for a child. He worked all day as a barber in Schenectady or Albany, I'm not sure where. But then he had his supper, came to the new barbershop that he was renting from, or the space he was renting from Chuck and Mike, and he cut hair for another 2 hours from 7 to 9. And he did a pretty good business. And he was open on Saturdays too, I believe. Yeah. So that was a success. He equipped the shop with some used chairs and mirrors, and Spence took great pride in the job that he himself did, mounting the mirrors and trimming them out with precision saw cuts. And he did a really nice job on those. After the construction of a small one-bedroom apartment on the second floor on the west side of the building, the fourth and final space for renovation was a first-floor commercial two-room area with an entrance on the west side of the building. It was to become the beauty salon run by another relative of my father. This time it was his sister-in-law, Marjorie Kelly. It was the last portion of the renovation and remodeling, and Spence had been at work at the building, I think, for over a year. He had been renting a room all this time, as I had said, upstairs at the Duanesburg restaurant. And it had become, that building had become almost his second, or maybe almost his first home. He had redone the whole interior, not without help, but he'd done it. He wanted to rent the 2 rooms for his own little spot, but partners said reluctantly no. They preferred to rent it to a commercial, for a commercial reason. So Spence, I don't know, that was 62. Spence died about 10 years later, and I don't know what his history was afterward. So we're now at, there's the house moved back. That's the best I could find, again, in a limited search. There's the store, which had been sold by Mott and Sherwin, but they still own the building, the federal building, as they were calling it. With the entire building remodeled and rented, the partners breathed a sigh of relief. The parking was much improved. What had been a mostly unused building was brought back to life. And for better or worse, downtown Duanesburg had a new look. Mike Schrade, becoming weary of the daily grind of running the general store, gradually transitioned into becoming an insurance agent. His father had a small insurance business, which Mike took over after becoming a licensed broker himself. But he doubled up for a while, running the store, and then he set up a little office where the post office had been, and he made a little entrance into there, so he'd sometimes cut meat for somebody and wrap it up, and they'd go off, and then he'd go into his little office there and do some insurance work, and Adeline Putnam or Adeline was about the only one left at that time who was working for the store. About that time, this is 64 now, when Gale and White chose to retire and sell his much larger insurance company in Delancey, Mike and Chuck agreed, and Mike wanted to sell the general store so he could use the proceeds from the sale to buy Galen's both apartment building and office, which is still located next to the fire department. It's now, it had been a house, probably a duplex, I think. Then it became a rental upstairs and an insurance office downstairs. And then I think now it's back to being an apartment. Dad moved his business to that building, and for the next 10 years, 12 years perhaps, he had a long commute from Duanesburg to Delancey, which was huge compared to walking from his home to the general store. This home, our old home, my old home, as a child, is still standing, but it's overshadowed by a giant hedge and stewards fence. So if you look closely on the left as you're going east on 20, you can still see it. A guy named Ed Fitzner bought the former Mott and Schrade's and opened up Fitzner's Superette. And do we have number 25? No.
That's,
Never mind.
okay.
Not yet. We're
Not yet, okay.
All right, sorry. So Chuck and Mike still own the federal building. Tragedy struck the Mott family in 1964, which I think most people know. Chuck's son and a good friend of mine, Russell, was involved in a nasty car accident, became confined to a wheelchair for the remainder of his life. Then in 1966, Chuck passed away due to cancer, leaving Alice and Russell with the farm. Mike and Alice agreed that it was time to sell the remaining piece of property for what had been a successful 20-year partnership between the two families. The post office building was sold to Featherston and Mosier in 1968. They in turn sold it to Dick Sanders in 1972. He sold it to Bob Perillo in 1980. I think these are mostly accurate. It became Jonathan's in the mid-90s. I can't remember his name. It was John Roberts, maybe, or something like that. And it is now, of course, the Landing. So there's our. Oh
No,
that was the one.
that was the one you wrote.
I'm sorry. That was. We got that up at the. We got it up at the Historical Society, but we couldn't sharpen it. I think it was when it was taken, it was fuzzy.
Yeah.
For some reason, nobody took, as we said at the beginning, nobody took any pictures of the move or really of the building. If anybody comes across one, send the picture to the Historical Society. And from about 1960 to 1980, it more or less looked like that, I think. Perillo's put on a wing and then put on a second floor to the wing, and there's the Landing on 20, and it has a paved parking lot. First time, I think. Yes. Nicely paved. All right. That was the conclusion. That was the conclusion. Okay. But
Still have one.
there are, let's see what time it is. Well,
Just go through them quick.
I go fill, these are space fillers here. Interesting trivia. Maybe if you don't like them, just start getting restless and pretend you're wanting to leave.
Can I just ask a question?
Oh, sure.
Was Russell Mott the printer, did he have a printing company?
Yes.
Okay.
And
all right.
Scott took it over.
All right. Thank you.
Eventually. Yep. And Russell, he kept going all through the rest of his life. He owned the TOD Press, Town of Duanesburg Press, and he published that. I think it was a weekly, maybe.
He wrote for the newspaper too, didn't he?
Yep. And they were able to keep the farm because when I-88 was built, the construction companies needed a lot of fill, as you know, and Russell and Alice had it, and they excavated. They scraped a lot of topsoil off the gravel, made big piles. I remember this. Then they must have excavated 10 or 15 feet or more of what had been the hayfield. More than that, probably, Eddie. So when you used to go up a hill to get to the farm, now you're going almost straight and then to the left. But that provided income for Alice and Russ, which they really needed. There was one unfortunate consequence to those trucks running in and out of the hauling gravel, and that was the Kennedys on the end of the road got really, really upset, and a friendship that had been going for decades. Suddenly, it was a big border fence was put up. It was one of the problems was, I think, the noise and the dust, naturally. So that was maybe the only unfortunate part of that.
So the post office was in the big brick building, right?
It had been in the. It had been
That's where it was then. It was.
in where the bank is. Is that what you're saying?
No, brick building.
Yes, the general store.
Mott and Sherwin.
Mott and Sherwin's. Before that, it had been to the east, to the west in Duanesburg Restaurant. Before that, I think it had been in the structure, I don't know, I guess it's a home now, next to the right of the hub. I might be wrong, but I think it was over there. I'm looking at Bart to see if
Well,
he
I
knows.
think it was at one time, but I don't know how long,
Yeah.
in where Salzburgs lived, right next to the diner.
Oh, it was there too?
Oh.
Yeah.
I was told that, but
Yeah.
it was before my time, so I can't verify.
One of the themes in your presentation is the reuse of houses and lumber from houses that recur a lot. Probably happened a lot more, 50 years ago than it does now. But one of the interesting reuses of the house that is in the hamlet that was started out as the Manhattan Mill House, built in about 1872, and it was a square, white, two-story house. The Manhattan family lived there, and then when the D&H came through, they had to move the house, and they moved it maybe 50 feet, 100 feet, something like that. But then it became the station for the D&H. And then my understanding is that, at that time, Vincent told me that his grandfather was the station master and that his mother was born in that house.
That is correct.
His mother being Esther Vincent, who was town clerk. And, but at any rate, that house then had a third life. From what I read about it, is that became, lumber from that house was taken up, and if you look at what was a welding shop across from from the parking lot at Stewart's, to the right of that is a square white house, two-story, and that, I was told or read, that was the lumber from that house.
I didn't know that. When I was a kid, the Grote family lived there.
Steve,
Are you, Dave?
an issue with the cinder blocks?
Oh.
Yep, that's in the trivia. I'll get right.
I stepped outside for a moment, sorry.
Okay. After the new foundation for the house was constructed, and the house placed on the new foundation, it began to buckle from the weight of the house and the pressure of the fill up against it, I believe. A form was constructed inside the basement over the entire front of the basement wall, in parallel to it. Probably was 18 inches, 24 inches, I would imagine. I don't know. Again, I don't think there was any engineer that was making these decisions. I think it was who's the concrete guy in Duanesburg, So they constructed the form. Spence was in on that one, I know. And then there was no truck with a big hose in those days, of course. So it was all gasoline-powered little cement mixers. They'd mix up the cement, put it in the wheelbarrow, and then wheel it in to the basement because the house is overhead, and with pails they go up and dump it in. What an awful job. Actually, though, in my trivia thing, I have another awful job which I can tell you. But anyway, they also to go along with that, the community hall, the fire hall, suffered, I believe, essentially the same problem, probably with the same kind of
Yes,
blocks.
they shouldn't have used cinder block, although it was lighter and cheaper. It was also more porous.
Yeah.
And they didn't think about expansion and contraction due to variations in temperature. And that they have a phenomenon now which you can see, well, you can see it in the post office in Duanesburg, an expansion strip. Every few, like 15 feet or 20 feet or whatever, you ought to have an expansion joint.
Yeah.
Well, that community or fire hall was 123 feet long without any. Well, there was no way to fix it. But go back to you.
So, but it was fixed by demolishing it.
Well, yeah, it was fixed by the federal government.
And Salzburg. His son. Vernon Salzburg. Did he not rent the
Salzburg
grant?
got the grant.
Government grant.
$387,000.
Yeah.
Because it was at a time in the mid-'70s when construction companies needed work and they needed a boost. So he applied for it, and Linda and I just sort of helped with the paperwork. But he was the idea man, and that whole thing was done for no cost to taxpayers.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And I remember we had a big party in there right before they tore it down. We had a band and everything. We were the last ones in there. I think the following weekend they tore it down.
April 6, 1977 was the demolition day.
All right. Another little story. Chuck and Russell Mott moved. Bart mentioned he was talking about motels and cabins and restaurants last month. Chuck and Russell Mott moved one of the cabins from the Oaks during the night on Chuck's flatbed. It was at night. Russell drove the truck. I remember Chuck telling my dad and me about this. Chuck stationed himself on the roof of the cabin as they went through town. He had either a pitchfork, a pike pole, probably borrowed from the. And so he, as they went under like the telephone and the wires, he lifted up, the stoplight, and it was done late at night, and they apparently made it all the way over to the gravel pit, where it turned into Russell's Playhouse. Yeah. He was about 16 then. Anybody ever visit that little playhouse? Oh yeah. Anyway, okay. Another little tidbit. Mike, Chuck, and likely Spence, along with other men and boys, used to spear eels at night in the Normanskill. The eels were on their annual journey from the Atlantic to the Hudson to spawn in the tributaries of the Hudson River. And so they go at night, they take flashlights, and they had these kind of trident type of spears. And I remember at least one morning, my dad went, and there was a pail in the general store in the cooler, a pail of water with like 3 or 4 eels swimming around, or kind of hanging out in there. And I said, what are these, Dad? And he said, those are eels. We got them last night. And Art Tulloch, who was an old timer here, Bart talked about him with the.
He had a funny back.
He
He
always
would always
said,
go either this way or this way. He wouldn't go
like
straight
this
up.
or like this, and he had back problems.
Yeah.
But he liked eels. I'll tell this, and maybe that'll be about enough. The plot behind because Dave's here. The plot behind the house was a soggy wetland with very tall cattails, which we as young boys would explore and wander through often. As it was filled with gravel and other contractors asked and were given permission to dump certain types of debris over the bank, it started to fill. In one instance, it was either a road crew, which apparently had extra tar that needed to be dumped somewhere, or maybe it had been the guys working on the store roof, tarring the store roof. I'm not sure. At any rate, a bunch of tar had been poured over the bank in the partially filled in parking lot, and still to be untouched by the gravel where it was late summer, late August, where the dried up cattails and other kind of brushy plants. Somebody came and Rhoda Foster was in her brand new apartment with a big window looking down on the whole parking lot. That was her view. So somebody either flicked a cigarette or, I don't think anybody did it on purpose, but somehow the brush got on fire, then the tar got on fire, and the smoke was black as night, and it was a pretty big blaze. Fire department came, took care of it. Rhoda Foster later said she sat up there with her bank book in her hand, hoping somebody would come up and rescue her. So she was. So that I thought that's kind of funny. And Dave, no, we know.
Yeah, Steve and I were buddies growing up. We never got in trouble. With all maybe once in a while. The state came through. Remember, Route 20 was a concrete, blocks of concrete. There was a period of time, and I think this is the origin of the tar. They drilled holes in each section, and apparently there were voids under them, and they pumped tar into the voids. And I think found a big void. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah. Oh, and I've got to tell this one. I'll try to make it short. The old house, the old building had almost no insulation in it, and when it was renovated, and I think in those days, insulation was not unheard of, but it wasn't widely used. There was no insulation in the attic, and the renters were not responsible individually for their heat. So it was supposed to be factored into their rent, but the rent was a little too low, and the heating bills were taking away any profit that Chuck might have had. So it became apparent that insulation needed to be installed in the attic. So Chuck went down, I think, to Selkirk, probably owns Corning, to get the best deal he could on insulation. He came back with they're big bales like the size of these tables, kind of rectangular bales of fiberglass, just loose. They look like cotton. And that's what I thought when I reported for work one Saturday morning with Russell and Chuck and Johnny, the hired hand. I don't know if Uncle Hank was there or not, and a few other guys, victims. So the process, the bales were down in the basement, and feed bags were used. There were a bunch of empty feed bags, and so we just to fill up the feed bags with fiberglass, and Well, you gotta know, back in those days, I'd never heard of fiberglass, really, especially not this nice soft stuff. So, anyway, we didn't have gloves, we didn't have masks, we didn't have anything. So we're just putting fiberglass into these feed bags, and then we carry them up to the second floor, through the front entrance, up the stairs into one of the rooms that had an access door into the access space to the attic. Hand them up there. There's a way. Hand them up there. They then go empty them out, and you take the bag back and you get a refill. Well, by noontime, lunchtime, I went home, and I wasn't more, I don't think, than 12. So I was a little wimpy, I admit, but I was itching like I'd never itched before, and I thought, and I took all my clothes off, and I got in the bathtub thinking I could wash this stuff off. I looked kind of sparkly too, and I mostly I think it was on my arms and neck and so forth, but the clothes. My mother washed them about 4 or 5 times and tried to get them, but every time I put those pants and shirt on, I could still feel those fibers. So when we talked about what was the other kind of icky job, I can't remember.
The cement buckets.
The cement bucket, yeah. This one ranked right up there. I fortunately was granted clemency. I didn't have to report back after lunch, and that was it. So I put in a lot of time over there, and sacrificed probably a few parts of my lung to the insulation of that place. All right, that's it. Do you have any other questions or comments? Patty?
You showed a picture of Kid Wilbur's store.
Yes.
With the thing in there. My last 2 years in high school, I jump off the school bus, put my Texaco outfit on, and I've been down to work there. Now, in those days, we didn't have 911 for any kind of emergency or anything. And if you had a fire, you called the store.
Yeah.
And then the store, there was a switch on the wall in the back of the store, and that turned on the siren. And then a volunteer fireman would come to the store, and we'd stand out front and say, the fire is here, whatever. Yep. And sometimes somebody would go write it on the blackboard there at the store. But it was in... I think at night, if it came in, Kid Wilbur answered it, ran over to the store, and would go to switch and turn the siren on. And every day at noontime, that siren would go on, get up to speed and come back down again. So, it was fun.
Yeah. Well, yes, sir. Mr.
I just wanted to say that the store used to be so much more than a store. My grandfather never had a telephone. He always went to the post office and the store every day, hung around for a half hour, talked to all the people, found out what was going on, and saw all of his friends there, and it was a very important part of daily life.
Yeah.
I have a quick story about Spencer Christman's work style. My father-in-law, Mulford DeForest, had the Duanesburg turkey farm, and he hired him to do a lot of the building. And at that time, he had 4 boys, one of them my husband, and then 3 others. And they were all within 4 years of themselves, and kind of rascals, and totally in Spencer's ways he was trying to build. And he, tried to get them to go away. They didn't. So he nailed my brother-in-law's pant leg to the floor.
There you go. It's a good Spence story. I've heard other stories too, but not for tonight.
All right, good job, Steve.